November 16, 1944. A military transport convoy crawled through freezing rain toward Fort Des Moines, Iowa, carrying cargo that would challenge every assumption both sides held about their enemy. Inside the canvas-covered trucks sat 34 German women, members of the Wehrmacht's Auxiliary Communications Corps, captured during the Allied advance through France. They were cold, terrified, and completely unprepared for what they were about to experience. As the convoy came to a halt outside the processing facility, guards ordered the women to disembark into weather that had turned brutally cold, with temperatures dropping toward freezing and rain turning to sleet. What happened in the next 15 minutes would become a story told and retold for generations. A moment of unexpected humanity that would ultimately transform both prisoners and guards alike. Before we discover what made these women weep over an American soldier's simple gesture, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 24-year-old Margarethe Klein stepped down from the truck bed, her thin military-issue jacket already soaked through from the rain that had been falling for hours. She had served as a radio operator at a Wehrmacht communications station outside Calais, believing absolutely in the propaganda that portrayed American soldiers as brutal savages who showed no mercy to prisoners, especially women. She had been told that capture meant certain assault, that American men were undisciplined animals who viewed German women as spoils of war. She had been told to take her own life rather than fall into American hands, that death was preferable to what would happen to her. As she stood shivering in the November cold, waiting for whatever horrors would come next, she tried to prepare herself for the worst. What she witnessed instead would shatter every certainty she had ever held about her enemy. The women huddled together in the rain, 34 frightened prisoners standing in a foreign country, surrounded by armed guards, with no idea what fate awaited them. Margarette's teeth were chattering so violently she could barely speak. Beside her, 21-year-old Anna Weber was trembling, her hands wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. The thin jackets they wore had been adequate for garrison duty in occupied France, but were completely insufficient for an Iowa winter storm. Several women were crying quietly, their tears mixing with the rain on their faces. Fear and cold combined into a misery that felt almost unbearable. Then something happened that none of them had anticipated, that contradicted everything they had been taught about American barbarity. A young American corporal, no more than 23 years old, with the name Wilson stenciled on his uniform, looked at the shivering prisoners and without hesitation began removing his own coat. He walked over to Anna, who was shaking so hard she could barely stand, and draped his heavy wool military coat over her shoulders. His action triggered something in the other guards. Within seconds, 5 more American soldiers were taking off their coats and giving them to the German prisoners, who looked coldest. Margarethe stood frozen, watching this scene unfold with complete incomprehension. This wasn't the behavior of savages. This wasn't what you did to people you viewed as less than human. This was kindness, simple and direct, offered without hesitation to women who were supposed to be enemies. Corporal Wilson approached her, holding out his coat. "You're freezing," he said in English she didn't understand, but his gesture made his meaning clear. Margarethe stared at the coat, then at the soldier's face, searching for signs of the cruelty she had been promised. She found only concern, the same expression her own brother might have worn if he saw someone suffering from cold. She took the coat with trembling hands. It was heavy, warm from Wilson's body heat, and smelled of wool and soap and humanity. As she pulled it around her shoulders, feeling warmth begin to seep into her frozen muscles, something broke inside her. Not her spirit, but her certainty. The careful construction of propaganda that had defined her understanding of the world cracked in that moment, and doubt flooded through the opening. If Americans were the monsters she had been told they were, why was this soldier giving her his coat in the middle of a freezing rainstorm? Why would any of them? Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Anna clutched Wilson's coat to her chest, her expression shifting from fear to confusion to something that might have been the beginning of hope. 29-year-old Sergeant Helga Schmidt, the ranking officer among the prisoners, watched the guards give away their coats with visible disbelief. She had been in the Wehrmacht for 6 years, had heard hundreds of briefings about American cruelty, had been specifically warned about what would happen to German women who fell into enemy hands. Nothing in her training had prepared her for this simple act of human decency. The morning of November the 17th brought the women their first full day in the processing facility, and with it more opportunities to observe the unexpected humanity of their American captors. Breakfast was served in a heated mess hall, the warmth itself a luxury after the previous night's cold. The food was basic military fare, but it was hot, plentiful, and served without any of the degradation Margarethe had expected. Oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with butter, coffee that was actually coffee, not the ersatz substitute they had been drinking in France. The guards rotated through on patrol, and Margarethe noticed they were wearing lighter jackets than they had given to the prisoners the night before. The coats from the previous evening had been collected during the night and replaced with proper women's winter clothing from military stores, but the gesture itself remained. Those American soldiers had stood in the cold themselves for hours to ensure their prisoners didn't freeze. The contradiction between propaganda and reality was becoming impossible to ignore. As Margarethe ate her breakfast, she found herself watching the guards with new eyes, looking for signs of the brutality she had been promised, but seeing only professional soldiers doing their jobs without cruelty or malice. Corporal Wilson entered the mess hall during the morning shift change, now wearing a different coat. He caught Margarethe's eye and nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement that she returned almost involuntarily. Later, through the facility's German-speaking interpreter, a second-generation immigrant named Catherine Hoffman, Margarethe asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the previous night. Why did he do it? Why did any of them give us their coats? Catherine translated the question to Wilson, who looked genuinely puzzled by it. Because they were cold, he said simply, as if the answer was obvious. What else would we do? Let them freeze? Catherine translated, and Margarethe felt another crack form in her certainty. To Wilson, it wasn't even a choice. It was just what you did when someone was suffering and you could help. The idea that nationality or enemy status might override basic human compassion didn't seem to have occurred to him. In that moment, Margarethe understood something profound. The propaganda hadn't just lied about American behavior, it had lied about American character, about the fundamental values that guided their actions. The breakthrough came on November 20th during an afternoon orientation session where Catherine Hoffman was explaining the camp rules and expectations to the assembled prisoners. The women sat in the recreation room, no longer shivering but still uncertain about their situation and their future. Catherine had been born in Germany but raised in America from age 5, and she understood both cultures intimately. As she explained the rules, she noticed the women's expressions, the way they tensed whenever guards entered the room, the fear that still lingered despite 3 days of respectful treatment. Catherine set down her notes and spoke directly in German, her tone shifting from formal to personal. "I need to tell you something," she began. "I can see you're still afraid. I understand why. I know what you were told about Americans. My own grandmother wrote to me from Germany before the war, telling me to be careful of American men, that they were dangerous and uncivilized." She paused, letting that sink in. "But I want you to understand something important. The coats, the food, the way the guards treat you with respect, that's not special treatment because you're women. That's just how Americans think you're supposed to treat prisoners. They have rules. They follow those rules, even with enemies." Margarethe raised her hand, something she wouldn't have dared to do with a German superior officer. Catherine nodded at her. "Then why did they tell us Americans were monsters? Why would they lie about something so important? The question hung in the air, and Catherine's expression grew sad. Because if you believe your enemy is a monster, you won't question orders. You won't wonder if what you're doing is right. You'll fight harder and ask fewer questions. Fear is a weapon, and your leaders used it on you. The words struck Margarethe like a physical blow. She thought about all the time she had followed orders without question, all the time she had transmitted messages she didn't fully understand, all the time she had been too afraid to ask if what Germany was doing was right. The propaganda hadn't just controlled her understanding of the enemy, it had controlled her understanding of herself, of her duty, of what she was capable of questioning. And in that moment, sitting in a warm room in Iowa, surrounded by fellow prisoners and American guards who treated them with basic dignity, Margarethe felt the full weight of how thoroughly she had been manipulated. December 8, 1944, brought an event that would crystallize the German women's transformation in a way that simple daily kindness could not. The first packages from home arrived, having taken weeks to navigate the complex channels of international mail and military censorship. 20 of the 34 women received letters or small parcels from family members in Germany. The contents and messages revealed truths about the war that propaganda had hidden from them. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the officer in charge of the women's facility, arranged for the packages to be distributed in a private setting where the women could process whatever news they received without public scrutiny. As Margarethe opened her package from home, her hands trembled. Inside was a letter from her mother, written in careful script that showed how much effort had gone into each word. Margarethe began reading and felt her world tilt on its axis. Her mother described the situation in Hamburg, the Allied bombing raids that had destroyed entire neighborhoods, the food shortages that had reduced daily rations to near starvation levels, the rumors that filtered through despite government censorship about Germany's deteriorating military position. And then, carefully worded to pass censors, but clear to anyone who knew how to read between the lines, her mother's plea. Stay where you are, Margarethe. You are safer there than you would be here. Do not rush to come home. There is nothing left of the home you remember. Margarethe lowered the letter, tears streaming down her face. Around her, other women were having similar reactions as they read their own mail. Anna was sobbing openly, her letter revealing that her family's home in Berlin had been destroyed. Helga sat in stony silence, having learned that her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front 3 months earlier. The war they had been told Germany was winning was actually a catastrophe. The enemy they had feared was treating them better than their own government was treating the people back home. Catherine Hoffmann moved through the room, offering quiet support and tissues, her expression reflecting sympathy for these women confronting painful truths. When she reached Margarethe, she knelt beside her chair. Your family? She asked gently in German. Margarethe showed her the letter, unable to speak. Catherine read it quickly, her face showing understanding. Your mother is a wise woman, she said softly. She knows you are better off here, and she loves you enough to tell you that even though it means being separated. Margarethe looked up at Catherine, her voice breaking. We were lied to about everything. The war, the Americans, our chances of winning, everything. Catherine nodded slowly. Yes. But now you know the truth. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. The statement was simple but profound. Margarethe had been raised to follow orders, to accept what she was told, to never question authority. Now she was being given the freedom to think for herself, to make her own judgments, to choose what she believed. The freedom was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The weeks following the package arrivals were marked by a subtle but significant shift in the facility's atmosphere. The German women began engaging with their situation more actively rather than simply enduring it. They asked questions about American culture, about democracy, about how a country made up of so many different peoples managed to function. They wanted to understand the enemy that had shown them more humanity than their own leaders. Margarethe found herself increasingly drawn to conversations with Catherine Hoffmann, who became a bridge between two worlds. One afternoon in late December, Margarethe asked the question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. "Catherine, when you came to America as a child, did you stop being German?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "I stopped being only German," she said finally. "I became something more, German-American. I didn't have to give up one to become the other. America is strange that way. It lets you be both. It expects you to be both." The concept was revolutionary to Margarethe. In Germany, she had been taught that identity was singular, fixed, defined by blood and soil and nation. The idea that identity could be multiple, fluid, chosen rather than assigned, challenged everything she understood about who people were and could be. "What if we don't want to go back to Germany after the war?" she asked quietly. "What if we want to stay here?" Catherine's expression showed both surprise and understanding. "Then you find a way. Many German immigrants did before the war. Maybe after the war, when things settle, there will be ways again." January 23rd, 1945, brought news that would force the women to confront the darkest truths about the regime they had served. American forces in Europe had begun discovering concentration camps, and military intelligence decided that German POWs, including the women at Fort Des Moines, should see photographic evidence of what had been done in Germany's name. Captain Mitchell arranged for a private screening, understanding that the material would be traumatic, but believing the women deserved to know what they had unknowingly supported. The women filed into the recreation room, uncertain about what they were about to see. Captain Mitchell stood before them, her expression grave. "What you're about to see is difficult," she said through Catherine's translation. "These are photographs taken by American soldiers at camps in Germany and Poland, camps where people were systematically murdered. I'm showing you this because you have a right to know the truth about what was done in your country's name." The photographs appeared on the wall, projected one after another. Images of Auschwitz, of Bergen-Belsen, of emaciated survivors and mass graves and the systematic machinery of industrial death. The room filled with sounds of sobbing, gasping, and shocked silence. Margarethe stared at the images with growing horror, her hand over her mouth, trying to process what her eyes were showing her. She had known the Reich was harsh, had heard rumors about camps for political prisoners, but this systematic extermination was beyond anything she had imagined possible. Beside her, Anna was weeping uncontrollably, her entire body shaking with sobs. Helga sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face, her military composure shattered by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. When the photographs finally ended, no one moved. The lights came back on, revealing a room full of women in various stages of emotional collapse. Some were crying, some sat in shocked silence, others looked physically ill. Captain Mitchell spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "I know this is hard, but this is what your government did while telling you lies about American brutality. This is what was happening while you were being fed propaganda about defending civilization. This is the truth." Margarethe raised her hand, her voice barely a whisper when she spoke. "How could we not know? How could this happen and we not know?" Mitchell's response was measured. "Because you weren't supposed to know. Because evil hides itself in rhetoric about duty and patriotism. Because questioning was made dangerous, so people stopped questioning." That night, the barracks were filled with quiet crying and whispered conversations that went on until dawn. The women held each other, trying to process guilt and horror and the unbearable knowledge that they had been complicit, however unknowingly, in atrocities beyond comprehension. The coat that Corporal Wilson had given Margarethe on that first freezing night seemed like a lifetime ago. A small kindness that had cracked open her certainty. Now that certainty had been obliterated completely, replaced by a responsibility to acknowledge truth and to somehow, impossibly, find a way to live with what she now knew. The weeks following the camp revelations were the darkest period in the facility's history. The German women moved through their daily routines like ghosts, mechanically performing tasks but showing none of the gradual adaptation that had been developing. Some stopped eating properly, unable to swallow food, while knowing what had been done to starving prisoners in those camps. Others barely spoke, lost in private hells of guilt and horror. Captain Mitchell was genuinely concerned about the prisoners' mental health, recognizing that the psychological trauma of confronting such evil would have lasting effects. It was Helga Schmidt, the ranking sergeant, who finally found a way forward, though not in any way anyone expected. On February the 14th, she approached Captain Mitchell with a proposal that caught the commander off guard. "Ma'am," Helga said in careful English she had been learning, "we want to work, real work, not just camp duties. We want to contribute to something good, to try to balance what was done, even though nothing can balance it." Mitchell understood the impulse. These women needed to do something, anything, that felt like atonement or contribution or a step toward redemption. She brought the proposal to the War Department, which approved a program allowing the German women to work in local hospitals, helping care for wounded American soldiers returning from Europe. The irony was not lost on anyone. German women who had served the regime that wounded these men, now asking to help heal them. The response from the women was overwhelming. All 34 volunteered immediately. They underwent basic medical training and were assigned to military hospitals in the Des Moines area, working under supervision but with real responsibilities. They changed bandages, assisted with physical therapy, wrote letters for soldiers who couldn't use their hands, and provided companionship to men who were far from home and facing long recoveries. The work was hard, often emotionally brutal when caring for men with devastating injuries. But the women threw themselves into it with desperate dedication. Margarethe found herself assigned to the psychiatric ward, working with soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, but would later be recognized as PTSD. She sat with men who had seen horrors in Europe, who had nightmares about combat, who struggled with guilt over things they had done or seen. And in their pain, she saw a reflection of her own. They had been sent to fight a war they didn't fully understand, had been asked to do terrible things in the name of duty, and were now trying to process the moral weight of their experiences. One soldier, a 25-year-old lieutenant named David Morrison, struck up a hesitant friendship with Margarethe. He had been at the liberation of Dachau, and the experience had broken something in him. Through their conversations, conducted in David's minimal German and Margarethe's improving English, they found unexpected common ground. Both had been young people caught up in something larger than themselves. Both were struggling with the burden of knowledge about what humans were capable of doing to each other. Both were trying to find a way to live with what they had seen and learned. "You gave us your coat," Margarethe said to him one afternoon, the memory of that first night suddenly clear in her mind. David looked confused until she explained about Corporal Wilson and the freezing rain. He nodded slowly. "Because you were cold," he said, echoing Wilson's words from months ago. "That's just what you do." Margarethe felt tears in her eyes. "In Germany, we were taught not to see prisoners as people, just as enemies, just as less than us. But you Americans, you saw us as people first, even though we were your enemies. Why?" David considered this carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "because we're taught that human dignity isn't conditional. You don't stop being a person because you're on the wrong side. You don't deserve to freeze just because your country made bad choices. If we treated you like animals, we'd become the monsters we were fighting against." His words struck Margarethe with profound force. The Americans had won not just because they had more resources or better tactics, but because they had maintained their humanity while fighting inhumanity. They had refused to become what they opposed. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, arrived with complex emotions at Fort Des Moines. While Americans across the country celebrated in the streets, the German women prisoners faced the reality of repatriation to a defeated, devastated homeland. Official orders had come from Washington. The women would be returned to Germany within months, processed through displaced persons camps before being released to whatever remained of their former lives. Captain Mitchell called an assembly on May 18th to announce the details. "Transportation will be arranged over the coming months," Mitchell announced through Catherine's translation. "You will be given documentation, basic supplies, and passage to European ports. From there, you will be processed and released to return to your homes." She paused, her expression softening. "I want you to know that you have conducted yourselves with remarkable dignity here. You have worked hard, faced difficult truths, and shown real courage in choosing to help rather than to hate. I am proud of the women you have become." Several women began crying quietly, overwhelmed by the unexpected praise from someone they had once feared. Margarethe raised her hand, her voice steady despite her emotions. "Captain Mitchell, some of us have no homes to return to. Some of us, we want to request permission to remain in America, to immigrate here after the war. Is this possible?" Mitchell's face showed the strain of an impossible answer. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The legal framework for that doesn't exist yet. But I promise you this. I will write letters of recommendation for anyone who wants to stay. I will advocate for you. What happens after that will be up to higher authorities." The following weeks were agonizing. Days passed with no clear answer from Washington about the immigration requests, while preparations continued for mass repatriation. The women who had decided to accept return began saying their goodbyes to the Americans who had become friends. Letters were exchanged. Promises to write were made. Corporal Wilson, who had given his coat on that first freezing night, sought out Margarethe specifically. "I heard you might stay," he said. "I hope you do. You deserve a second chance. All of you do." Margarethe embraced him, no longer caring about regulations or propriety. "You gave me more than a coat that night," she told him. "You gave me the first reason to question everything I had been taught. You gave me the beginning of freedom." Wilson looked uncomfortable with the profound gratitude, his face flushing. "I just didn't want you to be cold," he said again, as if kindness needed no deeper explanation. And perhaps, Margarethe thought, that was the point. Perhaps the most revolutionary act was treating kindness as ordinary, as expected, as simply what you did. June 29th, 1945. Brought the day of departure for most of the women. 28 prisoners boarded transport trucks bound for the port in New York, beginning the long journey back to a Germany they knew would be unrecognizable. They carried letters of recommendation from Captain Mitchell, certificates acknowledging their hospital work signed by medical officers, and personal notes from soldiers they had helped and guards who had become friends. They would return to Germany as ambassadors of an unexpected truth, that their enemy had been more humane than their own government. That kindness was more powerful than propaganda. That transformation was possible even for those who had served evil unknowingly. 6 women, including Margarethe, Anna, and Helga, remained at Fort Des Moines, their immigration petitions still under review in Washington. The waiting was agonizing, each day bringing either hope or despair as rumors circulated about decisions and policies. They continued working at the hospitals, their status uncertain, but their dedication undiminished. On August the 15th, 1945, the day Japan surrendered and the war finally, truly ended, a telegram arrived from Washington that would change their lives. The immigration petitions were approved. All 6 women would be granted provisional refugee status, allowed to remain in the United States under sponsor supervision with a path to eventual citizenship. The conditions were strict, the timeline uncertain, but the opportunity was real. Margarethe held the official notification in trembling hands, reading it over and over to confirm it was real. She had lost one home, but was being given the chance to build another. Captain Mitchell found her in the recreation room, staring at the letter with tears streaming down her face. "Happy tears?" Mitchell asked, though she knew the answer. Margarethe nodded, unable to speak. Mitchell sat down beside her. "You know it won't be easy," she said gently. "There will be people who hate you because you were German. There will be suspicion and prejudice. Building a life here will be hard." Margarethe wiped her eyes, her voice steady despite the tears. "It will be hard," she agreed. "But I will be free. Free to question. Free to choose who I become. Free to try to live a life that makes up for the evil I unknowingly served. That is worth any hardship." The 6 women scattered across America, building new lives with determination and grace. Margarethe became a translator for the State Department, eventually working to facilitate communication between former enemies and help German refugees navigate immigration processes. Her fluency in both languages and her understanding of both cultures made her invaluable. She married an American veteran in 1949, a man she met through the hospital program who understood her complicated history and loved her anyway. Anna pursued nursing, working at veterans' hospitals and dedicating her life to caring for wounded soldiers from every war America fought. She never married, saying her work was her family and the soldiers she helped were her children. Her gentle compassion became legendary among the medical staff who worked with her, many of whom never knew she had once been an enemy prisoner. Helga used her military experience and leadership skills to work with refugee resettlement organizations, helping displaced persons from across Europe find new homes in America. She became a fierce advocate for immigrants and refugees, arguing that America's strength came from giving second chances to people who had lost everything. Her testimony before Congress in the 1950s helped shape immigration policy in ways that benefited thousands of people fleeing communist regimes. But the story's most remarkable chapter came in October 1974, when Corporal Wilson, now a retired postal worker living in Iowa, received a letter from Germany. It was from one of the women who had returned in 1945, organizing a reunion for all 34 original prisoners at the site where Fort Des Moines had stood. 21 women confirmed they would attend, traveling from Germany and across America, bringing children and grandchildren who had been born after the war. They gathered at a memorial park that now occupied part of the former military base. Stories were shared in English and German, tears were shed, and yes, there was laughter. Captain Mitchell, long retired and in her 70s, attended with her own grandchildren. Corporal Wilson came with his wife and sons, still uncomfortable with being treated as someone special, for doing what he considered basic human decency. Catherine Hoffman, who had served as interpreter and bridge between cultures, came as well, her presence a reminder of how identity could encompass multiple worlds. The reunion featured a ceremonial moment that brought everyone to tears. Wilson had brought the coat he had given to Margarethe on that first freezing night, preserved carefully for 3 decades. He presented it to her formally, saying through Catherine's translation, "This belongs to you. It always did. It was the coat that started everything." Margarethe accepted it with shaking hands, pressing it to her face and breathing in the scent of old wool and memory. "This coat taught me that kindness is more powerful than hate," she said, her English now flawless after 30 years in America. "That seeing people as people, rather than as enemies, is how we save the world from itself." Anna stood to speak, her voice carrying clearly through the crowd. "We came to America expecting monsters," she said, the words echoing the title of a speech she had given many times over the years. "We had been told Americans were brutal, uncivilized, barbaric. Instead, we found people who gave us their coats in the freezing rain, who treated us with dignity when they could have treated us with cruelty, who showed us that our government had lied about everything and in doing so, gave us the freedom to choose who we wanted to become." Helga raised her glass, her eyes finding each of the Americans in the crowd. To the soldiers who saw us as people first and enemies second. To Captain Mitchell, who gave us hard truths and second chances. To Catherine, who helped us understand that you can be many things at once. To America, which proved that a nation's strength is measured not in how it treats its friends, but in how it treats its enemies. Lieutenant Morrison, David, who had maintained his friendship with Margarethe through 3 decades of letters and occasional visits, raised his own glass. To the German women who taught us that transformation is possible, that people can face terrible truths and choose to grow rather than to hide. That courage isn't just about fighting, it's about changing. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through a park that had once been a place of confinement but had become a symbol of transformation. They had proven that even in humanity's darkest hours, when nations filled their citizens with propaganda and fear, simple acts of kindness could shatter those lies and plant seeds of something better. The German women who had expected monsters but found human beings had learned the most important lesson of all, that real victory is not measured in territory conquered or enemies defeated, but in hearts and minds transformed by the simple act of seeing past the labels of war to the shared humanity underneath. And it all began with a coat, offered freely on a freezing November night by a soldier who simply couldn't bear to watch another human being suffer from cold.